Hey, Derek here from Civic Punks, and the sun has just gone down here in Sydney, and I'm going to be going to bed soon because I have to wake up super early tomorrow to go to Melbourne. And I'm going to Melbourne because it's time for the Public Sector Innovations Government Innovation Week Victoria, and I am incredibly excited to go. I've flown all the way around the world for this, and so this is the pre-game show. So, what is a pre-game show, you might say? Well, any event happens within a context. And the purpose of the pregame show is really to dive into that context. What is the context that this week's event is happening within? And why does that context matter? How could that context shape what happens this week at Government Innovation Week? But before we dig into the context, I had a great chance to sit down with Ross Ashman. And Ross is one of the founders of the Public Sector Network, and he is one of the key architects of the event that we're going to this week, this Government Innovation Week. So I had a chance to sit down with Ross and really understand sort of his thinking going into this event, what he is excited about from this event. So let's dive in, let's hear what Ross has to say, and then we'll come back and talk about the context that makes this event really important. Okay. Well, Ross, thank you so much for joining us here for this pregame show about the Public Sector Network's Government Innovation Week happening in Melbourne next week, which is amazing, super soon. But you've been working on this for a long time and been doing this for a while as well. So before I dig in, first off, why don't you give me a bit of background about yourself and what brought you into this work?
Yeah, perfect. Great question. Good place to start. Myself and my business partner set Public Sector Network up over a decade ago. Really simply, we saw an opportunity to help government executives to identify relevant peers and network, to benchmark their programs and projects, and ultimately try to establish best practice on a global scale. As you would know, I think there's some really smart people doing great work inside of government. One of the challenges is that it's by design quite fractured, quite siloed, and so very often these lessons aren't necessarily learned or shared. So very humbly, our goal was to try and help accelerate innovation across the public service, try to reduce costs, and try to give them a much better understanding as to what the future looks like and how they can best align with that. Now, the events that we do is one of the key ways that we do that, and that's part of what Government Innovation Week makes up.
Brilliant. Well, let's talk about that. So Government Innovation Week is happening next week in Melbourne. What is your hope or your
It is.
aspiration with this event that's happening?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time to be involved in governments, especially in Victoria. I mean, I think if I just talk from a macro viewpoint, there's obviously a lot of disruptive trends coming through government around AI, productivity, efficiencies. And how technology really is all changing that. One of the big things that's come out of Victoria in particular recently is the Silver Review, which was really about how do we make government work better and cost less. So the Victorian government had a good, long, hard look at how it runs. And, if we're being blunt, it found that it probably had too many layers of management, too many organizations doing the same jobs, and some systems that were slow and expensive. So they've approached this in terms of, how do we reduce management layers? How do we merge or close overlapping agencies? How do we spend money more carefully? How do we use technology and AI to handle repeatable work? And really, how do we make it easier for people and businesses to deal with government? So these are a lot of the consistent themes we see across all agencies, all departments, all states, all jurisdictions across the world. But at this point in time, it's very, very pertinent for the Victorian government. And I think this event is going to be a really interesting way for peers to come together, have those conversations, and actually hear from other practitioners in the space about how they're necessarily sort of going about approaching that.
Amazing. So when you look at your agenda that you've put together, what are the sort of key pieces that you're most excited about, you're most excited to see people engage with?
Yeah, I mean, we're very lucky that once again we've got the Minister, the Honourable Danny Pearson, that's going to keynote, and I think that's really important because he is leading a lot of the innovation and investment across the Victorian public service, in particular when it comes to data centres and AI. There's a real big push to make Victoria the kind of state of innovation and AI and data centres. So it's going to be really interesting to hear from him. And we've then got a fantastic lineup across all 3 days that will be addressing things like data, digital, cybersecurity, cloud modernization, the people, the process, the tech elements. There's a specific day focused to local government as well, and cybersecurity. So I think it's a really good blend of all of the key themes and topics. And it's the second year we've run it in this format. Previously, we would run all of these topics as individual conferences. But actually, if you think about, our value proposition and our mission, it's about bringing people together. And you can't have these conversations in silos anymore. You can't talk about AI without talking about the human element, without talking about security, without talking about sort of capacity and capability. And so I think what's really nice is getting all these various practitioners, whether they be sort of technologists, business execs, technical users, in one place at one time, to really drive the state forward.
Yeah, I have to say I'm really excited, looking forward to it. And I think one of the things that I'm coming with as a question is I got to take part in a couple of the events you've done in Canada. And I'm really curious to see both the similarities and the differences between what happened in Canada and what is going to happen, the conversations are going to happen in Melbourne next week. So super excited. And just a big thank you for making
Good.
this happen and bringing these people together.
No, I mean, we're delighted to have you there. I think it's going to be really interesting to get your perspectives. I mean, what you will notice, I'm fairly confident, is that the structure and the format will feel very familiar because it's been designed that way for, the attendees to maximize their time on site and to maximize the networking and the outputs. You'll notice that overarching themes are pretty similar, and that's consistent across, all governments across the globe. But I think what you'll notice is the nuance in the difference in the topics about how far different agencies and departments are along with their maturity on some of these things. There's no doubt that in Canada, some of the agencies and departments will be further ahead on some of these programs and projects, and also in other areas further behind. And I think that's the interesting thing. Governments are moving at different speeds on different things. And that's where we see a real opportunity to try and cross-pollinate those ideas.
Amazing. Well, Ross, thank you for making this happen, and I'll see you very soon.
I look forward to it. See you on site.
Brilliant. Well, let's dig more into this context. We live in interesting times, as Ross is saying, and Victoria is no different. And I think part of it is to understand the broader context. So obviously right now we're in a intense geopolitical moment, with the war in Iran, for example, putting a lot of pressure economically on countries, including Australia. And one of the things that all this is doing is it's really putting pressure on governments to figure out how to build up more of their own internal capacities. I'm really interested to see whether digital sovereignty comes up. It's a topic that came up in Canada a bunch, a topic that came up in Singapore when I was there. They talked about this idea of cognitive sovereignty, particularly as it relates to AI. And so I'm kind of curious to see how the geopolitical situation is putting pressure on Australia, and particularly Victoria, to think about its own sovereignty, its own internal capacities. Obviously, the robo-debt scandal is still working its way through the system. And really, I think it'll be interesting to see how that impacts both the bringing capacity back into government in response to that, but also this whole idea of fearless advice. What does that mean for government? And I'll be curious to see if that feeds into the context of this event happening in. And then, of course, the terrible massacre at Bondi is something that is also a key thing that happened really recently, and is putting, I think, there's a lot of thinking about how does government respond to make sure this doesn't happen again. Beyond that, I think some of the key trends that I talked about in Canada are also relevant here. So beyond digital sovereignty being a topic, this whole question around AI is going to be a big one. And what I'm really interested in is everybody wants to be sort of the central hub for AI in whatever region they're in. But one of the things that I've noticed that's shifted is a year ago, there's a lot more conversations around AI safety. The UK hosted a whole AI safety summit, and everybody was talking much more about AI safety. That has not been the case now. Something shifted. I have friends who were AI ethicists, and they were full of work a year ago, and now many of them have left because there's just no work left. Something has happened, and I think it's partly to do with this geopolitical situation we're in. But I'm curious as to if there's any space for conversations around AI safety, or if it's just like full steam ahead on AI. So this is something I'm quite curious in. One of the things I'm also curious about is Australia is one of these countries that has a much more like the whole conversation around the relationship between government and the indigenous communities is a much more front of mind thing here in Australia, like it is in Canada. And I'm personally very curious to see how that's going to play into the conversations this week. Obviously, land acknowledgement is a standard here in Australia, but at a deeper level, how is this going to feed through the event, and how's it going to come up in the event? And I think the other thing that's, as Ross mentioned, is going to be really important here is the Silver Review. The Silver Review, I've been digging into it over the last couple of days. It's quite interesting. So this deep dive, trying to make sense of what the Victoria Public Service needs to do to improve its efficiency and be more effective. And I think this is part of a much bigger conversation that's happening all over the place, where governments are trying to figure out, they expanded during the pandemic. How do they contract? What does that look like? Austerity is back in vogue again. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't hurt your delivery, your outputs. I think there's an assumption that AI is going to backfill stuff, but it's more complicated than that. And I think there's been a rush to make cuts. So hopefully the Silver Review does give some direction on this. And as Ross said, that is fairly recent. So it is going to be a key feature in this conversation. So in summary, key things I'm looking at is AI and how AI is going to play out, this whole question around the Silver Review and how that is going to play into the conversations, the role that the Aboriginal community plays and the culture plays in the conversations that happen. And yeah, just really excited. I think really curious to see how this compares to other conversations in other parts of the world that I'm seeing. So stay tuned, and I will be sharing my insights throughout the week. And of course, in a post game, we'll wrap this all together. And other than that, I hope to see you at Government Innovation Week in Melbourne in the next couple of days. Stay tuned.